sequels don't always make more money. In fact, the vast majority of time, they make less than the originals and make quite a lot less for a variety of reasons given to you at first. For the reasons that people get burnt out with characters that they've seen before, for the reasons that they feel as though it's tokenistic. Often they loop in stories within like Jurassic Park. They like rediscover an island that didn't exist before. The story doesn't make sense. It's clearly just trying to drain every last ounce of money, even when it's not profitable to do so. Even when the last Jurassic Park movie's budget was greater than the actual income they got, clearly we have associated with there. But secondly, I would note that every film carries risks, inclusive of sequels, because as given in the example I just gave, when sequels don't make any more money than the budget. But thirdly, I would just note that a prioritized debate means that we can also cop the most successful instances of sequels. But fourthly, I would note that competition just demands a huge amount of new content that exists. Creation of things like Netflix resulted in people wanting more shorter form content, which resulted in things like TikTok, which was even shorter form content. People want, in the 21st century, want new things. They want them quickly, and they want them to be as different as the thing that they've seen before. The movie industry is dying quite quickly, and the only way that you can be as a large business and surviving is by creating new things that inspire people and change the way people perceive things. And the only way that you can do that is attacking new content. But lastly, I would just note that these institutions are probably okay with taking a bit of risk because they are large ones, they're very competitive ones, and they have an enormous amount of money. The budget for Endgame was like $350 million fucking dollars. Like, that's a lot of money. That should explain to you that they have a huge amount of money that they're willing to risk on new things, particularly if it's a high risk, high reward scenario, and particularly if you're making a variety of movies, some of which are going to be safe ones, which you can probably bank on doing quite well. Your Frozen 2s, your Inside Out 2s, note that this is a preferred debate or prioritized debate, which just explains that you can do some safe things, but because you have an enormous amount of money, you can do some risky things that could have an enormous amount of reward. Obviously, that's a sound financial decision. Clearly, the risk is not that significant of a claim. The second question that we would ask is, how do you capture the attentions of audiences most and best? This is the most significant issue in this debate because that is how you make money. You capture people's attentions and you do so consistently over a long period of time, not only in the short run with good stuff, but in the long run with new and better stuff. We give you a few claims, the first of which is that new movies attack new audiences. When you make things like sequels, you are probably only going to have only as many people that watch the original because those are people who liked it, and if they like that sort of stuff, they probably would watch the first one, which just explains to you that you're unlikely to get more audiences in the new one. But secondly, I would suggest, and more importantly, that society evolves over time, which is why you get movies like The Lorax, Barbie, and Black Klansman, which are far targeted to different issues that wouldn't have existed 20 to 30 years ago, or even 5 to 10 years ago. But thirdly, once again, short form content is king in the 21st century, and you just need to produce new things, otherwise you are boring and people will not watch your stuff. What does opposition say in response? Two claims. The first of which is that characters have captured audiences' attention, and you need to milk that for as much as money as you possibly can in the short run. The first thing I would suggest here is that you just have a limited scope that you can do that in sequels. There is not that much more you can create out of a character. A few explanations here. The first thing to say is that if you have a highly interesting character, movies are like 2 hours, you only have a certain amount of interesting things that you can cover of a character in that particular amount of time. And if you had something that was so interesting and so powerful, all movies are risky, which means that the first time around, you probably would push it through to try and guarantee that profit, which just means that in the long run, the sequels are unlikely to be as compelling, the new storylines are unlikely to be as good, which is where we get things that happen that we've seen more recently with things like Jurassic Park sequels, with things like Marvel fatigue, when you have fatigue of these things over time. The second thing that we would say in response here is that you don't capture an audience's attention with characters, you capture them with underlying themes and ideas. So for instance, with things like Deadpool, it was his humor and the like moral complications associated with his character and the fact that he was an anti-hero that captured people's attentions. You can distill those elements and recontextualize them for a new audience, which is only something you can do in an entirely new film. New concepts capture people over time, which is why when you look at things like Shakespearean texts, we don't look at them anymore, but obviously the themes and ideas of them still exist. But society changes, so you have to make new content. The underlying things that capture people will still exist. Also, massively funded movie industry probably has a pretty good idea of how to capture people's attentions and do so in a new and evolving way. But sure, I'll take that point.
The problem with your side is that it's dismissive of status quo, wherein there is a decline of progressivism, but secondarily, sequels gain more profit, even raise more conversation, but secondarily, you're still unable to explain how do we regain trust. But even if you don't buy that, you can still experiment in sequels and new things. It's about creating new future movies. It's better through our side.
Okay, like well above 15 seconds. But I would just respond to one of those three things because you spoke so fast that I legit couldn't understand it. But when you say that there's a decline in progressivism in that, you just knife your entire speech when you say that the most radical forms of progressivism now exist. So I'm confused. Should I believe your POI or 7 minutes of your speech? I'm going to choose to believe your POI. Cool. The next thing that we would note here is that you should, if people were that interested, you would just rewatch the old movies. The second claim that they then make is that radical elements are imported and improved quickly, and do so in new movies, and do so more in new movies than doing so in sequels. A few problems with this. The first problem is that radical things are very unlikely to do for a profit-driven industry because you do not want to take the risk. But the second claim that I would make is that the radical issues that are seen as radical are made to be most problematic in sequels as opposed to original movies, not because of the content itself, but because it's changing the law of what the original movie does, which is what the explanation that we give to you at Leader of the Opposition talks about in terms of things like the new Snow White movie and the new sequel has had massive amounts of backlash, which actually isn't a radical issue at all. It's trying to get new diversity, more diversity into these older movies, but there's just been an enormous amount of backlash on it because it's changing the original movie, because it's a sequel, not because of the content. So that means if we were to make a different movie that wasn't a sequel, that was about these same issues, it would have far less backlash, and these issues of diversity will be non-issues. These radical issues that they talk about simply don't exist. They do not give you any examples. It is far too late at third to bring them up now. Cool. The next thing we will speak about is diversity and how we actually get more on the outside and good forms of diversity. Why is this important? The first thing that we note here is that that you want to get new actors into your industry and new actors into your company, because that brings in new audiences to it. The second claim that we will make is awards, like the Academy Awards, are often voted and often given on things like the increasing amount of diversity and the change that you make in the industry, which are only things you can do in new movies. Great. Then how does this happen? The first thing that we note here is that the Academy Awards directly translate to viewers. People watch the Academy Awards and give you a certain amount of diversity because of that, and are more likely to watch your movies because of what they see as what is seen as a good movie. But the second thing I will note is their wall that they have to defend has to do these things tokenistically and has to do these things poorly the majority of the time, because there is clearly a revealed preference towards increased diversity in these movies, and the only way the vast majority of the movies that they make are movies that are sequels. The only way they can do it is diversity. This looks like The Little Mermaid. This looks like Snow White. Obviously, ones that are received quite poorly and ones with enormous backlash. Finally, then, of copyright claims. I won't spend long on this because this was dealt with very effectively at Leader. But the claim that they make is that you need to get it done now, and there's time pressure because you have patents and because you have copyright issues. They clearly just don't know copyright law, because intellectual property law, it actually used to be 99 years. It literally last year got changed to 70 years. You can't use characters plus 70 years past the author being dead. The problem that they're trying to point out is, well, Congress has a lot of issues, so maybe this goes through, I guess. Unclear. A few responses. First of which, this is often administered by international organizations, the international intellectual property things, which don't have a whole lot on its mind other than literally to police this. But the second claim I would make is that by the time this 70 years is up, audiences have so enormously moved on. Other than exceptions to the rule like Mickey Mouse, other than exceptions to the rule, maybe Star Wars, we actually don't know yet because it hasn't been 70 years since George Lucas has been dead. That is an enormous amount of time in the future. And I would just suggest that if those things are still popular, they will exist in the minority of movies that we do not prioritize, ones that we can still all co-opt and do under our side. Unclear that we can't do those. Unclear that the tipping point is that the majority of those movies. Clearly, you should vote side opposition. We give you better movies that have less backlash. The worst cases that the opposition will talk about, the government talks about, simply do not exist.
I thank the speaker for that speech. And just a quick reminder, the judges won't be able to write anything you say after 7 minutes, 15 seconds. With that, I would like to call upon the proposition bid. You have the floor. Here.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yep, good to go.
Okay. Yeah, I'm so happy. All right. Hi, I'm Marvhie. Pronoun she, they. See you as on 5th minute mark. I know this is not grants, but shout out to Aiden and Renzo for watching me. Okay, so I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition's case is losing because they overlook key practical realities of the film industry and make idealistic assumptions that don't align with how successful production companies operate. It's too idealistic and detached from the practical, from the financial, and market realities that drive long-established production companies in this debate. Their failure to address the business imperative for stability and profitability literally makes their case much more unbelievable. Fair wants to listen. The most important disclosure here, and my partners told you earlier from PM DPM, is that we're better create much more future movies. Two questions I want to burden push them even on the rip. If new movies are supposed to cater to generational changes, how do they explain the success of long-running franchises like Star Wars or Marvel, for example, which have adapted their themes over decades and still resonate with multiple generations? If regionality is the main kind of opposition to have keep audience trust, why do audiences continuously flock to remakes like The Lion King, The Beauty and the Beast, or Cinderella, for example, which is my favorite, both of which were financial and critical successes despite being remakes of the original classic? Let me mention the opposition's case, then we'll go deep in on our contributions. They claim to us that generational stagnation and lost creativity will exist in government. Note that this is completely assumptive and speculative. Options prioritizing sequels and remakes inherently prevents from catering to new generations. However, this is evidence. Sequels can evolve to reflect contemporary themes and values like maintaining the core that audience have. This is a line we share because studios producing sequels are highly aware of market trends and societal change, meaning that successful sequels often integrate current cultural and generational shift we have in timeline into their narratives to stay relevant. E.g., Top Gun, Marvhie appealed to modern audiences by including themes of teamwork, for example, and humility in an increasingly competitive world. Why this is not true? Sequels and remakes often adapt to meet the expectations of younger audiences. For example, the Marvhie movie successfully imagined its franchise with progressive, much more feminist messaging that appealed to today's generation while still maintaining its iconic legacy. But secondly, even if it's true, why is it not enough? Even if some franchises fail to fully modernize, they still generate immense profit and spark discussions about societal values. This means that it creates much foundation for new intellectual property or IP, while ensuring financial security for studios to invest in riskier, much more experimental projects. But secondly, why is it relevant? The big generation argument ignores a practical reality, sustaining entertainment industry, because sequels serve as a bridge to connect different generations, to allow older fans to introduce beloved stories to younger audiences, for example, like Romeo and Juliet, while ensuring the long-term profitability that sustains new storytelling ventures. Two questions regarding this case. First one, if opening sequels and remakes stagnate generational progress, how do they explain the massive success of culturally updated sequels like Black Panther, for example, Wakanda Forever, integrating modern Africa's diasporic culture? Why does prioritizing sequels mean studios would never create new stories? Can studios do both by leveraging the financial security of successful franchises? Secondly, that they claim that there's stunted character development for actors and creators under Savvy House. This is not true, Chair. Sequels and remakes often present opportunities for actors and creators to explore deep dimensions of established characters. For instance, the Dark Knight trilogy gave Christian Bale the chance to portray a more complex and evolving Batman compared to earlier versions, meaning that the creators have significant much more room and innovation, meaning there's a much more thematic benefit much better under Savvy House. And even if it's true, why is it not enough? We think that the entertainment industry is not a zero-sum game. Share, actors and creators can work on both franchise projects or regional movies simultaneously, meaning that a strong sequel under government model provides much more stable foundation for creators to pursue much more riskier, to pursue much more experimental work. So meaning that those experimental things we want to shelter are still existing on government's model. But lastly, why is it irrelevant? We think this debate is about prioritization and not just about exclusivity. Share, we focus on sequels because we think that the studios appear much more financial resources that literally important to pay that can be used to fund the experiment with new projects to give actors and creators more opportunity in the long term. We think that actors understand the fan product would acknowledge that American franchises often build their representation, etc. But lastly, that I think that best under Savvy we do not lose originality, but we rather build legacy. Why this is true and why this actually shut down the cases coming from opposition right? With these eight sequels and remakes, we're not just rehashing all the years. We're continuing legacies to resonate with new generation. And this is the real confession coming from the cries of LO and DLO. Because this strategy allows the production companies to balance nostalgia with much more innovation, which literally much more likely ensure both cultural relevance and financial stability in the long run. What partners already told you earlier, why are we winning? First things first. When we're able to tell you and establish already by PM and DPM that familiarity drives much more immediate interest. PM told you in framing that there is a clear and established audience for sequels and remakes. While the franchise says have a fan base that's already guaranteed Patreon safe, a guaranteed subscription, for example, in Netflix, right? This creates a much more urgent opportunity to capitalize on already successful intellectual properties. Because when you make sequels, you're more likely to get higher success rates. Why this is true? Three reasons. Sequels and remakes reduce space because they leverage known successes. Second, they create a sense of urgency to fulfill audience expectations. Thirdly, because they're more likely to eagerly await continuous updates to their favorite stories, meaning they're more buy-in subscription, etc. Right? Why only get true sustainability and track sustainability in government side, right? First, the likely outcome, as my DPM already told you, is having much more consistent revenue stream, meaning that in an industry where profit margins are shrinking, already production costs are increasing in status quo, which they never done at the first place, right? The producing sequels and remakes much more provides a reliable source of income. At best, we mitigate financial risk in government. At best, we ensure much more long-term sustainability. But even if you don't believe all that, in opposition, we already discussed by PM and DPM that you will more likely get piece of management. At best, the cost of failure on their side in government with sequels and remakes because the studio already target market, the specific people that they want to champion, and the stories that are already proven historically to be commercially viable, right? This ensures much more stable revenue comparatively to the up case, which is crucial to the long-term process. But lastly, even if you don't believe all that, we weigh it, right? DPM already extended by this by saying that we reduce much more production costs, which is an important discussion, right? Because this is business, guys. We think we're able to lower creative investment. Discussion under this. The first one is that sequels and remakes require less investment and conceptualization, as my partners already told you, in terms of story development, processes, and character building. Thus, the likely outcome is that we reduce the creative workload and overall cost of the pre-production, which is important to highlight because the marketing sequel or remake is more cost efficient. At best, we're able to tell you that the audience understands the house. It's not just familiar with the brand, but literally have much more meaningless effort is needed to introduce the movie, right? But only in government side, you're able to tell you and to establish that audiences have an emotional attachment. So much more promotional materials can rely on nostalgia, can just rely on recognition, can rely on legitimacy, the brand, etc. At best, we're able to tell you that the case coming from opposition is completely uncharitable when they do not understand the business the aspect and angle of this debate. With all these reasons, we proudly propose.
Thank you for the speech. Opti Heren.
Tony, I'll say anything else to the other woman there. I just came through the door and got the house arrest. Tony? Hi, I'm Ross.
All right, even though we just walked in and this whole place is one hallway, let's consult the map, okay? Uh-oh. Hey, Lois, are you sure this place is for men?
Yes, Peter.
Really? Because this kind of looks like a dress.
Peter, it's fine. Come on out. Cable.
Yep.
I'll be right back.
Okay, Lois, I'll be right here standing uncomfortably close to the unnecessary piano player in the middle of the hall.
POI is
Right now,
in the chat. Yep, thanks very much, Jade. I'm Ansh. Stacey is
Skylar, copy your piano.
starting my
Well, we
speech
could
in
probably
3,
come up with some
2,
recipe
1.
right
The problem with relying on empirical evidence in debates is that
Well, we
often
could
it is a
probably come up
lie.
with some
And that is what we see
recipes,
inside
right,
Gut here, because they give you examples, by the way, in place of mechanisms that are completely drenched in lies. And the average reasonable person actually knows these. For example, Star Wars currently, something that they so over glorify and rely on the success of, is actually in decline. See how much backlash all of the new shows that, all of the new sequels that Star Wars does, and all the new stuff that they keep on making. See how much backlash that gets from the original Star Wars fans, which in their world, the risk is of upsetting your loyal audience is something that is far worse, and I'll talk about it in a second. But secondly, another lie that they make, that they rely on, is that sequels earn more than originals. The thing is, most sequels do not earn more than the originals. And obviously, I am pushing this. This is an intuition pump against their intuition pump. But I think my point is just more believable because look at Disney. Sure, they made Frozen 2. Sure, they made, like, I don't know, Inside Out 2. But most of the material that Disney comes up with is just original content. I don't understand what world they're living in because the empirical evidence that they rely on is actually for our side because the counter because our world is one that is more close to the debate to status quo. Anyways, now few things in this speech then. Firstly, what do audiences look like? And note that this is the most important thing in this debate because if you are not able to understand your audience, you will not be able to milk them for the money that you so desperately crave as a large production audience. We tell you from first that 4 main things. Firstly, that people are constantly changing, which means that nostalgia is not enough. Sure, some people like love Harry Potter even though they're 35, but those a number of people are very limited. Nostalgia is not enough because often you change as you grow up. The animated films that you liked as a kid are not the same things that you like when you grow up. And the reason and the basic evidence here is look at the number of animated films that exist in the world today and look at who they're marketed towards. These children's films are still marketed to children and not to adults, not to the adults who watch the original film, who are so desperately wanting to see the sequels. That doesn't exist. When you make a film, and another reason is just that, like, if nostalgia was so important, then all movies for adults and people who've grown up would be just like sequels and animated films, which isn't the case. And
Right.
that is just because people keep changing. Secondly, we say that the world is changing, people's sensitivities change. I don't understand where the idea of progressivism comes from here. Our claim is simply that, I don't know, 50 years ago, Bollywood like barely had any women in movies, but now you can make a movie about a female lead. And this is exciting because the world is changing and you have different demands. Maybe the world is getting less progressive and more right wing. I guess you can make more right wing movies, but either way, the claim here is that as the world changes, your audience's behavior changes. But thirdly, we say that it is harder to gain an audience when you already have a pre-existing franchise because it's the opt-in is too much. You have to watch all the fucking things before you watch the seventh, eighth
Point of
sequel.
information.
So that is something later. That is something that you have to contend with. But fourthly, we also tell you that people are exposed to lots of content. In fact, this is huge because the amount of global content that an average Western person is consuming, things like Parasite, things like, I don't know, fucking Squid Games, is unprecedented and unheard of. Movies that were made in like foreign countries where the language isn't even what people in the US or people in the West understand. Those films are coming up and are becoming more popular. Netflix is pumping out so much fucking content. But also, fifthly, there are so many new companies that are entering the market. Things like A24. And that is because we live in a growing digital world where you do not need to hire extras. You can just AI generate them. Everyone has a camera in their pocket. Everyone can make a home movie, which means that in today's world, your audience is not only changing, but they are rapidly changing. While you might have loyal audiences who you can count on for a sequel, which we also have in our world, you can get fucking Frozen 2. Why would we not make Frozen 2? It's a prioritized debate, not a preferred debate. We can obviously make Frozen 2 if Frozen 1 was so immensely popular. But also, at the end of this, you should just believe that audience behavior is changing and people are flocking to things that you never anticipated them to watch. They are completely different and at rapid paces. Bollywood is now popular in Nigeria. No one in Nigeria speaks Hindi. South Indian movies that are not in Hindi are popular in North India, things that people did not anticipate. And so if your audience is changing and running away towards new content and have voracious appetites, creativity is what will disrupt the industry. What is the most important thing in this debate is to be able to adapt, is to be able to compete and maintain the monopoly that you had as a large conglomerate because you always had more money. You could have stayed ahead of the competition and invested in new forms of media that people clearly want. But instead, on side affirmatives world, you just make fucking sequels that no one cares about. And that is something that is quite bad. Point.
Profit margins are currently declining. Can you please give an example of a new successful fictional movie? Because the last time I checked, Barbie is a sequel, Oppenheimer is based on reality, Squid Games is a TV series.
Barbie is a sequel. Lie. Oppenheimer is based on reality. This debate wasn't about fiction. I don't know where you're reading this from. Like I just understand. Like I read the motion. It's so stupid to explain that. Also, if profit margins are lower, that is not true because new movies are just more popular. Look at Everything Everywhere All at Once. All of the examples that we give you. Also, don't rely on mechanisms because that's why. Like that's where the fucking lies come from. Anyways, lastly, then on risk. They say that it is more risky to make new films as compared to sequels that have reliable audiences and metrics. Firstly, I've told you why the audience cannot be reliable in the 21st century. And they say that you have like metrics such as merch sale and audience. Firstly, it's a prioritized rate, so we can also take unrisky awareness. But secondly, the risk of backlash and upsetting your fans is something that is far more damaging. Think about how many times a sequel has been made that has disrupted the core audience of a particular thing. So in the worst case, if side affirmative goes bad, then they lose their entire loyalty base something that they hinge their entire case on. If we go bad, it's like, oh, Disney made a bad movie. I guess they'll make another one, and maybe some people will watch it, but they lose their entirety of their core audience. And we tell you the reasons why this is going to happen, why you're going to lose your core audience, because your writing got lazy, because you cannot stretch storylines as much as you wanted to. There is a limited scope of sequels. People keep making silly loopholes to try to squeeze in more sequels and more storylines. All of this bastardization and flanderization of characters was what lost them this debate. It was what lost them their core audience, something that they so much cared about so much. At the end of this debate, what you should believe is the world is changing. You better change as well. Otherwise, you will make the 80th Jurassic World movie that doesn't work.
Thank you for that speech. Or reply here.
Great, just checking that I'm audible and visible.
Yep, good to go.
Great, thanks so much. I'll start my reply in 3, 2, 1. Panel, this government case rests on the assumption that we always choose the worst new films, and they always choose the best new films to make sequels of. This is blatantly untrue, deeply uncharitable, and entirely uncomparative. Please engage properly with our case. 2 questions then in this reply. Firstly, on the short-term economic benefits, and secondly, on the long-term economic benefits. What does government say in terms of short-term economic benefits? The first thing they say is that there's a guaranteed fan base, which means that these movies will be seen as less risky. There are a couple of reasons that this falls out of the debate. Firstly, in PM setup, they suggest that there are people who watch movies based on the brand name. This is where the majority of that fan base comes from, and that brand name recognition applies to us as well. Disney's newest movie is Disney's newest movie, whether or not it is a sequel or a new film. So the majority of the fan base that they speak of is symmetric. But secondly, we explain why the audience that they attract in a sequel is actually likely to be far less stable, because firstly, people age out of the demographic when they were originally in the first film's demographic. Secondly, it's hard to get into because there's so much history and lore. And thirdly, the issues that people care about over time change. They try to tell you about Marvel and Star Wars, but empirically, each Star Wars sequel film made less money than the last, and Marvel is currently making less and less money each film it props out. The effect Marvel fatigue is literally named after the fact that audiences are now unwilling to go see Marvel films. Their examples work to their detriment. The second thing they say is they can build on merchandising because you can sell more of the same stuff. But the issue of that is that you're still selling more of the same stuff. As we point out, if we can sell new stuff, create new films that we can make merchandise based off of, we can sell the initial merchandise, but also the new merchandise, which means we, on a numbers game, are probably able to sell more merchandise and make more money that way. But we also have a couple of independent substantive pushes. Firstly, that sequels are most likely to get angry fan bases. See the reaction to Halle Bailey, a black woman being cast as the Little Mermaid, to Rachel Zegler being cast as Snow White when she is Hispanic. See the Star Wars sequels, see Marvel films. They have angry fan bases who care if any small change is made, and this leads to less money. But thirdly, you can gear it specifically to new audiences, and we'll note, we still have our economic decision-making at heart, so we are likely to choose films that are most likely to get a big audience. We are not going to choose radical left things, though I will deal with that later. And thirdly, we have the capital to spend on this, and this is a prioritized debate. So if we run well, we can make Frozen 2, we can get all that cash. Okay, long-term benefits. The first push from a side government is that new movies are from the radical left. Empirically, this is untrue. They do not point you to things that are about the destruction of family values or how cheating is something we should all do. They simply say that this might exist. We'd suggest sense check this. These are big corporations who have to appeal not only to the American market, which does care about family values, but also to the Chinese market, which is one of the biggest movie markets in the world, which should tell you that they're unlikely to put anything in that is so radical. But secondly, sequels are often seen as the most radical because they're in direct comparison with an earlier film. See my example of The Little Mermaid or Snow White, which were seen as incredibly radical, as opposed to Hidden Figures, a film centering only black women that did not get the same backlash. See the new Indiana Jones remake, which had discussions of how feminism had gone too far, or the Star Wars remake, because both centered around women. But thirdly, new movies can have good values. We have fiat to choose which new movies we make, and we are of course going to choose those that test the best with audiences. We have checks and balances to achieve this, but also they tell you about IP expiring. Firstly, Disney lobbied and changed to make IP longer literally last year. Secondly, the films that monopolize on IP are often not heard of. See Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, the horror remake of Winnie the Pooh, which literally no one has ever heard of. But we tell you, sequels have bad writing, they have an expiry date, they're seen as cheap, and it's hard to make and maintain your brand name when you are seen as making bad films. Therefore, if you care about your profit, you must vote for side opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Prop reply. Here.
Confirming if I'm audible.
Yep, good to go.
Okay, I'll just fix my notes. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest question in today's debate is which type of fiction should high production companies focus on? Should they focus on extending sequels or should they focus on new fiction movies? This is if you obviously cannot create a sequel in a non-fiction or a movie based in real life. But secondarily, if you create a new movie based on an existing non-fiction movie based in reality, such as Oppenheimer, then that's practically conceding that sequels are better because that would be a sequel. This is important because the examples they give you are literally a sequel. Things like the Barbie movie, for example, things like Star Wars. Like, take a look at Barbie. For far too long, there are numerous series. Like, my cousins literally watch these types of movies, for example. So I don't necessarily see why these aren't necessarily a sequel. But secondary, take a look at Star Wars. These are really sequels at the end of the day. I just want to be very clear because opposition bench is stuck in their liberal bubble. And that's the exact same reason why they'll lose this debate. Comparatively, Gob's discussion is not only factual and realistic, but it is based on the real world. We give you numerous mechanisms, we give you numerous structural reasons and impacts. Opposition is lying when they told you we never gave you mechanisms. We give you many mechanisms, which I don't think they engage to. But secondarily, Op is lying when they told you that Barbie movie is a sequel. Again, a lie. They say Barbie, insofar as Barbie existed. Again, opposition lied when they talk about Squid Games. Again, this is not a movie. Like, I think vibe check. I mean, I think that's common sense. Opposition again lied when they say, "Oh, sales are not declining." Like, this is false because of, like, we gave you numerous reasons why sales are declining in status quo and why there's a necessity, for example, to be able to capitalize like your core audiences who have been disappointed, for example. But then they say, "Oh, all of our discussion is false because of the Marvel fatigue and so on and so forth." One, we told you as to why many people still opt into the sequels because of the nostalgia, or even if it's not the nostalgia, it's about how these movies shape who they are or the universality of these movies. Then they say, "Oh, Marvel fatigue," but then why? How? No matter why. Like if you're gonna look at status quo, movies are still selling high or conversion about Robert Downey. Conversations about Robert Downey as Doom, for example, is huge. But secondary, the amount of people buying Marvel merch is still massive. So I don't get what opposition is talking about. Like, why is this true? By the same mechanism, for example, especially when they echoed like Prime Minister, especially when LO echoed Prime Minister, especially when PM talks about as to how these equals are also relatable and a reflection of like society and so on and so forth. But secondary, I just don't get as to why we also don't get their benefits. Like, hello, screenwriters are also people, so I don't get why you get these benefits. But they really talk about as to how you lobby for something that doesn't mean you automatically pass a law. Again, I don't think opposition is engaging on either fronts. Even in the worst case scenario, let's assume the worst case scenario. Let's assume profit margins are dwindling, for instance. We do think this is still beneficial because at least there's still guaranteed profit because loyal fans are still gonna buy. Comparatively in op, the certainty of like people buying, for example, is incredibly huge because this debate is assessing whether or not the risks are worth pursuing or not, for example, because we already explained, for example, as to why, the risks are super big to the point that it's not worth pursuing. I have 3 questions to opposition. One, how exactly does this new movies look like? Because the benefit they discuss is hinge on telling us as to how these new movies looks like. Because if their concern is creating something that appeals to audiences, I don't get as to why that cannot happen in Gov. The closest thing they give you is Barbie, but again, I already disproved this. But secondarily, how practical is it to even create new movies? I think opposition completely overlooks or stick to their ivory tower because they fail to recognize the huge opportunity cost in status quo, the reputational damage to production companies, and the massive production, marketing, reputational cost, and the damage in attracting talent. No, they never really engage to this because they're not engaged because they're uncomparative. No, that is important because for one, they fail to engage to this point other than to assume that you will magically gain profit just because you create something new. Where's the mechanism? Where's the characterization? Where's the example? Nothing because they're lying. They fail to engage to this point rather than to assume that oh, we will understand audience in their side. Like, I don't know why this accomplishes in their side, and that's the exact same reason why opposition loses. Why are we winning this debate? One, I think our case is not only realistic, but we actually mechanize things. We give you the context or the problem that these companies are currently facing. Opposition just basically brushes off and explains as to why, oh, it's okay when people lose jobs. Because I don't think it's okay when people lose jobs. I don't think it's okay when many people suffer the consequences of like wrong decisions by management. I don't think it's okay, for example, to like use millions, for example, or like investors, for example, like losing trust. I don't think it's okay when you like damage reputation of like, you know, a very, very huge production company at the end of the day. Because again, opposition bench is debating in a utopia. And that's the exact same reason why they're losing this debate. Proposed.